Richmond, California, December 1942. The morning fog hangs over the bay like a pale curtain, muffling the clang of hammers and the hiss of steam. Beneath it, thousands of men and women move in rhythm. Welders, riveters, crane operators, their breath merging with the smoke of molten steel. Sparks fly like fireflies as the hull of a massive ship slides toward completion. A whistle blares. The crowd pauses, their faces lit by the glow of floodlights. Before them stands a gray giant, the Liberty ship SS Robert E. Peary. It looks ordinary, yet history is about to record the impossible. Sirens wail again. The last weld is sealed. Workers climb down as the shipyard announcer's voice cracks through the loudspeaker. 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes, from keel to launch. Cheers erupt. The hull hits the water with a thunderous splash and America's industrial miracle floats free. A ship that once took 230 days to build now exists in less than 5. And at the center of this transformation stands not an admiral or general, but a civilian named Henry J. Kaiser. The world was about to learn what one man's impossible idea could do. By the winter of 1940, the Atlantic Ocean had turned into a graveyard. Merchant ships burned on the horizon, their smoke trails stretching across gray waves as German U-boats prowled beneath the surface. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous campaign of World War II, had begun, and it was strangling the Allies slowly. Britain, an island nation, lived and fought only through the lifeline of the sea. Every tank, plane, bullet, and loaf of bread depended on convoys crossing the Atlantic, and those convoys were dying faster than they could be replaced. In London, Winston Churchill called it his greatest fear. In Washington, Franklin D. Roosevelt knew the United States would soon be drawn into the storm. The numbers were terrifying. In early 1941, Britain was losing more than 1 million tons of shipping each month. At that rate, the nation would starve before the enemy ever set foot on its shores. The solution seemed simple in theory. Build ships faster than they were being sunk. But that was the problem. In 1940, constructing a single cargo ship took about 230 days, sometimes longer. Shipyards were slow, skilled labor was scarce, and traditional methods relied on craftsmanship rather than mass production. The war was modern, but the way ships were built still belonged to an earlier century. The United States Maritime Commission stepped forward with a radical plan: create a standardized, mass-producible cargo vessel, one that could be built quickly, cheaply, and in enormous numbers. It didn't need to be beautiful, it didn't even need to last long, it just needed to float, carry supplies, and survive long enough to deliver them. The design was practical, based on a British model called the Ocean Class. The Americans named it the Liberty ship. The specifications were unremarkable: 441 feet long, 56 feet wide, top speed about 11 knots, slower than a modern fishing trawler, but what it lacked in speed, it made up for in purpose. The Liberty ship was to be the backbone of Allied logistics, the workhorse of freedom. Roosevelt called them ugly ducklings, but they would become the most important ships of the war. Yet there was one enormous problem: speed. In 1941, as the first Liberty ships were ordered, America's shipyards simply could not keep up. The Maritime Commission had aimed for 60 ships that year. They barely managed 30. The old shipyards of the East Coast worked at capacity, but they were built for peacetime, for precision, not volume. There was no way they could deliver the hundreds, then thousands of ships the war demanded. As Roosevelt pushed his famous Arsenal of Democracy speech, the U.S. was ramping up for a scale of production the world had never seen. Aircraft, tanks, trucks, and weapons all surged forward, but ships were the bottleneck. Without ships, the arsenal would never reach the front. Then came a man who had never built a ship in his life: Henry J. Kaiser. Before the war, Kaiser was known not for steel or war, but for dams. His construction consortia had built some of America's greatest engineering marvels: the Hoover Dam, the Grand Coulee, the Bonneville. He was fast, innovative, and relentless. His projects finished ahead of schedule, under budget, and against all odds. When the Maritime Commission began looking for new industrial partners, Kaiser's name surfaced, an outsider who might bring new ideas. Traditional shipbuilders laughed at the thought. Kaiser was a dam builder, not a naval engineer. Shipbuilding, they said, was a craft, not something you could rush with factory techniques. But the war left no room for tradition. In 1941, Kaiser was given a chance, a contract to LP managed new shipyards under the Emergency Shipbuilding Program. Instead of modifying old docks, he decided to build entirely new ones from scratch on the West Coast, in Richmond, California, Vancouver, Washington, and Portland, Oregon. These would be designed like factories, not shipyards, where ships could be assembled as if they were machines on a production line. Kaiser's idea was revolutionary. Break ships into prefabricated sections, build those sections simultaneously in workshops, and then weld them together at the yard. It was the same logic used in automobile manufacturing, only now it would be applied to something 400 feet long and made of thousands of tons of steel. To the skeptics, it was madness. To Kaiser, it was the only way. He poured money, manpower, and energy into the vision. By mid-1941, as America edged closer to war, the first Liberty ships began to roll off the new lines. Welding replaced riveting. Faster, cheaper, and requiring less skill. Modular components arrived from across the country. Engines from Detroit, steel plates from Pittsburgh, and valves from Chicago. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, Kaiser's shipyards were ready. America was officially at war, and suddenly time became the most precious resource on Earth. The nation needed ships, now. And Kaiser's factories were the only ones capable of producing them fast enough to matter. The transformation of American industry had begun, but even Kaiser could not have predicted what his methods would unleash. An industrial storm that would build not just ships, but victory itself. And at the heart of it all stood one simple question. How do you turn an ocean of need into a river of steel? By early 1942, the Liberty ship program had moved from a bold idea to a desperate necessity. The Allies were bleeding ships faster than ever. German U-boats operated in wolf packs, coordinated groups that prowled the North Atlantic by night, hunting merchant convoys in silence. The Atlantic became the decisive front, not of armies, but of logistics. If Britain's food, fuel, and munitions stopped arriving, the island would collapse, and Hitler's grip on Europe would tighten. The United States, still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor, now faced a colossal challenge: to arm, feed, and transport millions of soldiers across two oceans, and do it faster than any nation in history. Cargo ships were no longer simple vessels. They were lifelines, floating arteries of war. Without them, there could be no D-Day, no Pacific Island hopping, no aid to Russia through Murmansk. And yet, in 1942, the situation was critical. Nearly half of the ships sailing from America never returned. Even as shipyards expanded, traditional methods lagged hopelessly behind the scale of demand. Old-time shipbuilders clung to craftsmanship, wood, and scaffolds, slow riveting, small teams of specialists, while the war demanded something more akin to an industrial revolution. Henry Kaiser saw it differently. He was not an engineer by formal training, but he understood systems, the choreography of men, materials, and machines. Where others saw a dockyard, he saw an assembly line. He had done it with dams, organizing thousands of workers into precise, interlocking processes that turned chaos into coordination. Now he would apply that same principle to ships. Kaiser's first shipyards rose with astonishing speed. At Richmond, California, he built 4 major yards side by side. Each one had enormous slipways, cranes, warehouses, and machine shops, and all were designed around a single goal: to move ships through like cars through a factory. His workers didn't hammer out pieces on site. They built them in prefabrication shops where everything from bulkheads to deckhouses was assembled in advance, labeled, and ready to be welded into place. This shift from craft to system changed everything. A Liberty ship no longer had to be built in sequence from keel to mast. Instead, dozens of sections could be built simultaneously by different teams and then joined together. This modular approach meant that when the keel was laid, most of the ship's components were already finished and waiting. Once assembly began, it was only a matter of coordination. Cranes swinging, welders sealing seams, and pipes being bolted into place like clockwork. Welding was another revolution. Traditional ships were riveted, a slow, laborious process requiring years of skill. Kaiser's engineers replaced rivets with welded seams, cutting construction time dramatically. It also reduced weight, allowing Liberty ships to carry more cargo. Welding brought risks, cracks, metal fatigue, and occasional failures. But speed was the currency of war, and no risk was too great when convoys were dying daily. Then came the workforce, perhaps the most remarkable part of Kaiser's vision. The war had drained America's labor pool. Millions of men were in uniform, leaving a vacuum in heavy industry. Kaiser filled it with the unlikeliest army: women, African Americans, migrants, the elderly, even teenagers. His shipyards became a symbol of a new America, one that worked together under one flag, one cause. Posters read, "The man at the front is counting on you," and they meant it. By mid-1942, over 90,000 people worked in the Richmond yards alone. The clang of steel never stopped. 3 shifts, around the clock. The yards glowed through the night, a forest of cranes, sparks flying against the dark bay. For the first time in history, women took up torches and welding masks, standing shoulder to shoulder with men. They became icons of wartime production. Rosie the Riveter was not a myth. She was thousands of real women working under Kaiser's command. But the true genius lay in how Kaiser kept his workforce motivated and healthy. He understood that efficiency wasn't only mechanical, it was human. He provided canteens, daycare centers, and even built entire communities around his shipyards so families could live near work. When absenteeism threatened schedules, he didn't punish workers. He created the first industrial health plan in America, a forerunner to modern Kaiser Permanente healthcare. In war and peace alike, his workers mattered. While East Coast shipyards scoffed at his assembly line ships, Kaiser's yards began delivering results that stunned Washington. Where others took 200 days, his teams completed ships in 40, then 30, then 20. Every time the target moved, Kaiser raised the bar higher. His obsession wasn't just speed, it was proof that American industry could outproduce tyranny. The press began to take notice. Reporters visited Richmond and couldn't believe their eyes. Ships rolling off production lines like automobiles. Skeptics called it a stunt, propaganda. But the numbers told the truth. By late 1942, Liberty ships were leaving American docks faster than U-boats could sink them. Still, Kaiser wasn't satisfied. He pushed his engineers to go further, to test how far the system could be pushed. If we can build one in 20 days, he asked, why not 10? Why not 5? The challenge seemed absurd. Even his own foreman doubted it. The paperwork alone, they said, would take longer than that. But Kaiser smiled, the same quiet, confident smile that had seen him through deserts and dams. He believed that if you organized men and machines well enough, time itself could be bent. And so in late 1942, the impossible experiment began. A race to build a Liberty ship in just 4 days. The world would be watching, and the story of that race, and the impossible trick behind it, would soon redefine what it meant to fight a war not with guns, but with ingenuity. The Liberty ship revolution was more than steel and welding. It was a symphony of innovation played across every human and industrial note. Henry Kaiser's achievement wasn't the work of one genius act, but of several bold ideas converging in one extraordinary moment of necessity. At its heart, Kaiser's impossible trick was industrial organization. He saw shipbuilding not as an art, but as a process that could be disassembled, analyzed, and optimized. Traditional shipyards followed a linear order: lay the keel, build upward, finish each stage before beginning the next. Kaiser shattered that logic. He broke the vessel into more than 250 prefabricated sections, built simultaneously in different areas. Each section, deckhouses, hull blocks, engine rooms, was constructed in covered shops far from the slipways. Subassemblies were transported on rail tracks and cranes, arriving like puzzle pieces ready to lock together. The sequence was timed to the minute. The hull's bow and stern might be welded at the same time, while electricians installed wiring in pre-built bulkheads 100 yards away. It was chaotic to watch, but choreographed in detail, like an industrial ballet of sparks, smoke, and motion. Prefabrication didn't just save time, it multiplied production. A shipyard could now work on multiple vessels at once, staggering their stages of construction so no slipway ever sat idle. This was the true magic, not faster hands, but smarter systems. To achieve this, Kaiser drew inspiration from the automobile plants of Detroit and the aircraft factories of Boeing. He sent teams to study their assembly lines, then adapted the lessons to something 100 times larger. Conveyor belts became overhead cranes, toolkits became welding rigs. He even standardized materials, using the same steel plate sizes and pipe diameters across ships to simplify logistics. Where traditional yards employed master craftsmen, Kaiser trained ordinary citizens to perform single, repetitive tasks with precision. The result wasn't art, it was efficiency. Each Liberty ship was now less a handcrafted vessel and more a machine-built product of modern industry. But none of this would have worked without the people who made it happen. The workers of Kaiser's shipyards were unlike any the world had seen before. They came from every corner of America, farmers from the Midwest, miners from the Rockies, mothers from small towns, migrants from the South. Some had never seen the ocean before they began building ships for it. Women in particular were the quiet revolution behind the steel. By 1943, they made up more than 30% of Kaiser's workforce. Dressed in overalls, gloves, and bandanas, they worked night shifts beside men, welding seams and driving cranes. They learned quickly, and soon their speed rivaled that of any experienced laborer. For many, this was their first taste of independence and purpose beyond the home. African Americans also found opportunities that were rare elsewhere in wartime America. Kaiser's hiring practices, while not free from the prejudices of the time, were far more inclusive than most. Skilled black welders, electricians, and riggers worked alongside white colleagues. In some shipyards, segregated restrooms and dining halls remained, but on the deck, what mattered was output, not color. It wasn't equality yet, but it was a start, one forged in fire and sweat. Kaiser didn't just demand loyalty, he earned it. His management philosophy was revolutionary for its time. He built housing for workers, opened childcare centers so mothers could work full shifts, and ensured that transportation to and from the yards was organized. When health problems and injuries began to rise, he didn't shrug them off. Instead, he created prepaid medical programs so workers could see doctors without financial strain. That system, born from wartime necessity, would later evolve into Kaiser Permanente, one of the first large-scale healthcare plans in America. He understood that people, not machines, were the real engines of productivity. You can't get work out of a man, he said, if the man isn't healthy or if he's worried about his family. It was simple logic, but in the grinding machinery of war, it was rare compassion. The physical innovations of Kaiser's shipyards were equally astonishing. Traditional shipbuilding required massive scaffolds, long curing times, and skilled riveting teams. Kaiser replaced all of it with welding. Welding was faster, cheaper, and allowed thinner steel plates to be used. But it was also risky. Early on, cracks appeared in some ships due to metal fatigue, a flaw in both material quality and design. Instead of retreating, Kaiser's engineers studied the failures obsessively. They brought in metallurgists and naval architects to redesign weak joints and refine steel treatments. They learned how to manage temperature, humidity, and weld thickness. Every mistake became a data point, every failure a lesson. Within months, the Liberty ships were safer and sturdier than anyone believed possible. At the same time, the shipyards adopted a radical approach to workflow. Each station had a single responsibility: hull assembly, electrical wiring, piping, painting. Workers rotated in rhythm, passing their tasks down the line like components on a conveyor belt. Supervisors tracked progress on enormous wall charts, marking every weld completed and every delay logged. It was accountability at a national scale. Even logistics were optimized. Entire rail lines fed directly into Kaiser's yards, bringing raw materials 24 hours a day. Supply chains stretched across the country, linking steel mills in Pennsylvania to shipyards in California. The system was so efficient that in one instance, a steel plate rolled out of a mill on Monday and was welded into a ship by Friday. Behind the clamor and machinery, the spirit of competition drove everything. Shipyards raced against one another, Portland versus Richmond, Richmond versus Vancouver, each trying to set a new record. A wall in the main office displayed charts of build times, pushing foremen and crews to shave off hours wherever possible. It wasn't just patriotism, it was pride. And in that pride was a quiet, shared belief that no task was too large if it was organized well enough. By the end of 1942, the Liberty ship had become more than a vessel. It was a symbol, a steel embodiment of American ingenuity and unity. The production numbers were staggering. From just a handful of ships in 1941, the United States was now launching hundreds every month. The impossible was no longer a dream, it was a routine. But for Henry Kaiser, routine was never enough. He wanted to prove that his system could do more than outpace the enemy. It could defy belief itself. And to prove it, he would stage the most audacious experiment of the war, building an entire Liberty ship in the time it once took to draft its blueprints. The race for the 4-day ship was out to begin. The race to build a ship in 4 days wasn't simply a test of production. It was a reflection of everything Henry Kaiser believed about leadership, teamwork, and faith in human potential. His impossible trick wasn't a single invention. It was the redefinition of how people thought about possibility itself. Kaiser's leadership style was unlike anything the military or industry had seen. He was not a distant executive sitting behind glass walls. He was on the ground, sleeves rolled, hat tilted, walking the docks and talking to welders by name. He believed energy was contagious, and he carried it everywhere. He didn't bark orders. He inspired motion. His management philosophy rested on one idea: speed comes from morale, not fear. He encouraged supervisors to listen to their teams, to simplify processes instead of blaming workers for mistakes. When the Navy inspectors criticized the early Liberty ships for being too plain, Kaiser smiled and replied, "They're not built for beauty, they're built for freedom." He created a culture that treated the workforce like a family. Births, weddings, and holidays were celebrated on the docks. There were competitions for the fastest welders, the cleanest decks, the most efficient teams. Bonuses weren't just for engineers. Anyone could earn them, from janitors to crane operators. It wasn't just a workplace. It was a movement. His optimism seemed almost reckless, but it was infectious. When engineers told him that a ship in 4 days was physically impossible, he didn't argue. He simply said, "Let's find out." That phrase, equal parts challenge and invitation, became the motto of his empire. It was the same unshakable confidence that had built Hoover Dam years earlier, now redirected toward defeating fascism. Kaiser's leadership blurred the line between industry and patriotism. He didn't talk about profit or contracts. He spoke of duty. Every ship launched was a strike against tyranny. Every worker's shift a small victory. The effect was psychological as much as logistical. He gave ordinary Americans a tangible way to fight the war from home. Across the ocean, the Germans had no idea what was happening inside America's shipyards. They believed their U-boats would choke the Atlantic long before the Allies could respond. In early 1942, Admiral Karl Donitz had declared that Germany was winning the tonnage war, sinking Allied ships faster than they could be replaced. For every vessel launched, 2 went down in flames. But by 1943, something changed. Convoys that had once dwindled now swelled. Merchant fleets arrived faster, larger, and more often. The Allies began to supply Britain, North Africa, and even the Soviet Union with renewed strength. The German High Command noticed the shift, but they couldn't understate it. How could the Allies be building ships faster than the U-boats could sink them? The answer was Kaiser's invisible army, tens of thousands of civilians armed with torches and hammers. His system was not glamorous, not secret, not military. It was industrial democracy in motion. Ordinary citizens, through sheer organization, had defeated one of the deadliest weapons of war. The impact rippled far beyond the shipyards. Each Liberty ship carried 10,000 tons of cargo, tanks, trucks, food, and ammunition that fueled campaigns in Africa, Italy, and eventually Normandy. They became the lifeblood of Allied logistics. Even when some Liberty ships cracked in cold seas or went down to torpedoes, the loss was absorbed almost instantly. There were always more coming. Dozens, hundreds, thousands. Kaiser's factories had turned destruction into redundancy. For every ship lost, another was already sliding into the water. Germany's U-boats were no longer fighting ships, they were fighting time, and losing. There was also a moral undercurrent running through Kaiser's revolution. He had proven that industry could serve humanity, not exploit it. In an age of total war, when so much of the world's machinery was built for killing, his factories were built for saving, for carrying food, medicine, and soldiers toward liberation. For the workers, this mattered deeply. Each rivet, each weld carried meaning. They weren't just laborers, they were participants in a moral struggle. The Liberty ships were nicknamed ugly ducklings, but to those who built them, they were swans of salvation, plain, sturdy, and vital. Many of Kaiser's workers later said they had never felt such purpose. Women who had never earned wages now found themselves as part of history. African-American workers who had faced exclusion elsewhere found dignity in shared effort. Immigrants who barely spoke English became welders and foremen. For a few fleeting years, the shipyards became a vision of the America that could be, united, efficient, and driven by belief in something greater than themselves. Kaiser's social policies weren't just humanitarian, they were strategic. He realized that when people are treated fairly, they work faster, stay longer, and care more. The sense of collective purpose turned the impossible into the routine. His trick, in truth, wasn't mechanical at all. It was emotional. Every war has its weapons. The Liberty ship's greatest weapon wasn't armor or guns. It was morale. Each new launch ceremony became a national event. Bands played, crowds gathered, and newsreels carried the images to theaters across America. The message was clear. The United States could not be intimidated. When the SS Robert E. Peary was launched after just 4 days of construction, the spectacle stunned the world. Newspapers called it a miracle of the age. Photographs of the event reached every corner of the alley. Said world and proof that democracy, when mobilized, could outthink and outbuild dictatorship. Inside the shipyards, that energy became self-sustaining. Workers began to believe they could achieve anything if the plan was sound and the effort unified. Production times dropped further still, not because machines improved, but because people refused to fail. The line between morale and momentum blurred until they were one and the same. By the end of 1943, Kaiser's shipyards had achieved what even his supporters once thought impossible: continuous, overlapping launches, with one ship sliding into the water every 4.5 days on average. It was an industrial rhythm that echoed like a heartbeat across a nation at war. Every 4 days, another Liberty ship. Every 4 days, another chance for freedom to float. And yet the climax of this achievement, the moment when the world finally realized what Kaiser's impossible trick truly meant, was still to come. Because one record-breaking launch in late 1942 would prove beyond doubt that America's willpower could be built from steel. December 1942. The Richmond Shipyards, California. Floodlights cut through the fog, glinting off cranes and hulls. The air smells of salt, sweat, and welding fumes. Men and women move with a singular focus. No wasted motion, no hesitation. A voice echoes from a loudspeaker. 4 days to launch. Let's make history. This was it. Henry Kaiser's most daring experiment. The challenge: to build an entire Liberty ship, start to finish, in less time than it once took to paint the hull of a single ship. The goal bordered on insanity. The SS Robert E. Peary would be assembled from keel laying to launch in just 4 days. The project began before dawn on November 8, 1942. Workers gathered under spotlights as the first keel plate was lowered into place. To most, it was just another ship. But to Kaiser, it was a statement. He wanted to show the world that industrial speed could win wars just as surely as tanks or planes. The rhythm of construction was almost militaristic. The moment the keel touched the blocks, prefabricated sections began arriving on flat cars, already shaped, drilled, and ready to weld. Tower cranes swung across the docks like metronomes, lowering pieces of hull and deck into precise alignment. Sparks erupted as welders sealed the seams in bursts of light. Every department had its own clock. Every delay was recorded, analyzed, and corrected in real time. The shipyard's cafeteria ran 24 hours a day. Medical staff stood by in case of accidents. Engineers worked in shifts, sleeping in their offices. And through it all, Kaiser walked the grounds with his familiar confident grin. Notebook in one hand, stopwatch in the other. On the first day, the hull began to take shape. Prefabricated bow and stern sections were aligned by cranes while pipe fitters threaded fuel and water lines. On the second day, the superstructure was lowered into place. Deck houses, engine rooms, bridge platforms. Electricians followed, stringing wiring through conduits that had been prepared in advance. There was no time to pause. By the third day, the shipyard roared like a factory at full throttle. Over 200 men and women worked in unison. Welders crouched over molten seams, riggers balanced high on girders, and teams of painters moved in behind them, coating the steel before the next shift arrived. It was a ballet of precision and pressure, the embodiment of Kaiser's philosophy: break every task into its smallest possible motion, perfect it, and execute without hesitation. Reporters arrived from San Francisco and Los Angeles. The Navy sent observers. Even the Maritime Commission dispatched inspectors to verify the claim. Skeptics whispered that it was a publicity stunt, a show to rally morale. But the yard kept working day and night through wind and rain. Every hour shaved from the clock was another step toward proving that the impossible trick could become reality. On the fourth day, the ship stood complete. The gray hull towered above the bay, its number stenciled cleanly on the bow. SS Robert E. Peary. It was not just a vessel, it was a declaration. Kaiser's workforce had done what no other nation had attempted, taken a process measured in months and compressed it into days. At precisely 4:15 p.m. on November 12, 1942, the final weld was finished. The yard fell silent for a brief electric moment. Then the air erupted in cheers, whistles blared, banners unfurled. The Peary was ready to launch. Crowds gathered along the waterfront as the ship slid down the greased wooden ways. Reporters scribbled furiously. Photographers captured the descent. With a deep metallic groan, the hull met the water, sending up a plume of spray. The crowd roared. It wasn't just a ship launching day, it was a new definition of what human coordination could achieve. From keel laying to launch, 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. That number would echo through the industrial world like a thunderclap. Kaiser, standing with his engineers, simply nodded. "Now," he said quietly, "let's make it routine." The achievement was symbolic. One ship built at impossible speed, but its implications were vast. It proved beyond doubt that industrial warfare was about systems, not scale. It wasn't the ship that mattered most, but the process behind it. Kaiser's methods could now be replicated across dozens of yards, multiplying output exponentially. And they were. Within months, shipyards across America began adopting the Richmond model. Prefabrication became standard practice. Assembly lines replaced traditional scaffolds. Timetables were rewritten. Where one ship had been launched every few weeks, now one could slide into the water every few days. But the Peary's success also came with challenges. The pace of production strained supply chains to their limits. Eel mills worked non-stop, and railroads struggled to deliver materials fast enough. Fatigue among workers grew severe. Accidents increased. Kaiser's health programs and worker support became critical in maintaining morale. Still, no one wanted to slow down. The shipyard's time boards displayed every milestone, a visual reminder of what could be done when people refused to accept impossible. For the workers, the Peary was not just a ship, it was personal proof that they could achieve greatness without uniforms or medals. For Kaiser, it was a glimpse into the future, a world where mass production could be applied to peace as powerfully as it had been to war. When the news reached Washington, officials were stunned. Roosevelt reportedly smiled and said, "Well, that's one way to win a war." The press turned the Peary into a national symbol of determination. Newsreels played in theaters, showing welders cheering as the ship hit the water. Headlines declared, "Civilian builder defeats time." Even the British Admiralty took note. Churchill himself mentioned the achievement in private correspondence, calling it a miracle of American energy. The Germans dismissed it as propaganda, but Allied soldiers at the front saw the difference. Supplies began to flow in larger volumes, faster and steadier. Every Liberty ship meant more food, more ammunition, more hope. The Peary itself went on to serve actively, carrying supplies across the Atlantic and surviving the war. But its true legacy wasn't in its voyages. It was in what it represented. The moment when the industrial age and human will fused into one unstoppable force. The Battle of the Atlantic, once a war of attrition, had quietly turned into a war of production. And America had found its most unlikely general, a man with no rank, no uniform, and no fear of the word impossible. But the story didn't end with the Peary. The ripple of that single 4-day miracle would reshape every part of wartime production and redefine the very meaning of victory. After the SS Robert E. Peary's record-shattering launch, the world took notice. But Henry Kaiser didn't slow down. If anything, he accelerated. The 4-day miracle was never meant to be a one-time spectacle. For Kaiser, it was proof that human organization could be industrialized, that the act of building could itself become a weapon. Within days of the Peary's success, Kaiser's engineers were dissecting the process like scientists analyzing a breakthrough experiment. Every step, every weld, every crane movement was reviewed. What slowed them down? Where could minutes be saved? Where could people be better positioned? Out of that analysis emerged a doctrine that would ripple across the Allied war effort: continuous flow construction. It was deceptively simple. If each task was divided, standardized, and sequenced perfectly, then hundreds of thousands of people could build as one mind. The lessons from car factories and dam projects now ruled the shipyards. What once was chaos, sparks, noise, confusion, became a rhythm. Welders were assigned zones like soldiers on a battlefield. Materials arrived by schedule, not by chance. Tools were placed exactly where they were needed. By early 1943, the Richmond yards became a living organism. Trains rolled in at dawn carrying steel plates from Pittsburgh and engines from Detroit. Forklifts snaked between scaffolds. At night, under floodlights, the yards glowed like a second city beside the bay. Ships stood in half-complete rows, their skeletons framed against the mist, a silent army of steel waiting to join the fight. The results were staggering. In the span of a few months, production time per ship dropped again, from 42 days to 20, then to 10. Some ships were launched in a week. By late 1943, Liberty ships were being completed faster than German U-boats could sink them. The ratio that once doomed the Allies in the Atlantic, ships lost versus ships built, had flipped. In Washington, Admiral Emory Land of the Maritime Commission declared that the American merchant fleet was no longer a hope, but a tide. Roosevelt called Kaiser personally to congratulate him. "You've done something beyond belief," the president said. Kaiser's reply was modest. "We've just made it simple, Mr. President." But simplicity hid genius. Kaiser had built an entire ecosystem around speed. He created the nation's first large-scale system of industrial hospitals to treat injuries immediately, the prototype for modern health plans. He introduced daycare centers near the yards so women could work full shifts. He arranged canteens, housing, and transport lines to remove every obstacle that could slow production. It wasn't just innovation in steel. It was innovation in humanity. And the workforce changed with it. By 1943, nearly one-third of Richmond's shipyard employees were women. Many had never handled machinery before the war. Yet under Kaiser's guidance, they became experts. They called themselves Kaiser's welders. Photographs of them, goggles on, faces lit by sparks, would become iconic symbols of the American home front. The Liberty ship itself was simple by design, 441 feet long, 10,000 tons, carrying cargo at just 11 knots. To naval engineers, it was plain, even ugly. But to the men who built it, it was beautiful because it was achievable. Every piece could be prefabricated, transported, and assembled with minimal tools. Every section had instructions. It was war reduced to its most efficient formula, mass and motion. The Germans scoffed at the boxy silhouettes that began crowding the Atlantic. "They look like floating barns," one U-boat commander remarked in his log. But behind those barns was a logistics miracle. Each Liberty ship carried enough supplies to sustain thousands of soldiers, trucks, ammunition, rations, even locomotives. Each one Theaton had arrived meant another operation could proceed. Every convoy that made it across the Atlantic shortened the war by days. By mid-1943, Allied command recognized that shipbuilding, not gunfire, had become the hidden battlefield. Every Liberty ship launched was a victory against time, against resource shortages, and against the Axis blockade. Kaiser's name became synonymous with speed. The press dubbed him the miracle man of production. To his critics, he was reckless, a man who gambled with deadlines and dared to promise the impossible. But to Roosevelt, to Churchill, to the workers in the yards, he was proof that America's real weapon was organization. Still, Kaiser knew the system was fragile. The war demanded constant adaptation. As Liberty ships multiplied, so did the need for faster repairs, more dock space, and better coordination. Kaiser's engineers began working on modular dry docks, floating cranes, and mobile repair units that could travel to remote bases. He even proposed shipyards that could be dismantled and reassembled near the front lines, an idea that foreshadowed post-war construction techniques. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic, the results spoke for themselves. Convoy losses dropped sharply. The Allies now escorted merchant ships with air cover and destroyers, and the influx of Liberty ships filled every gap. The once perilous run to Britain became steady, predictable. By 1944, more than 2,700 Liberty ships had been built, more than enough to replace every vessel lost since 1939. The tide of the war was turning, and Kaiser's revolution was part of the reason why. His approach proved that technology and leadership were not confined to the battlefield. Factories and shipyards were now as decisive as any army. Yet for Kaiser, the real climax came quietly. In mid-1944, as Allied troops landed in Normandy, Kaiser stood again on the docks at Richmond. Before him, an entire forest of masts and funnels rose from the bay, ships stretching into the mist. He watched them slide into the Pacific and the Atlantic one after another, each bearing the same stamped words, "Built by the American people." A reporter nearby asked him what he felt seeing so many ships leaving at once. Kaiser smiled faintly. Pride, he said, and relief, because every one of these ships means fewer boys in the water. The Piri had been the spark. What followed was the fire, an industrial inferno that consumed doubt and forged a new definition of national power. And by the end of 1944, when the Allies held the upper hand in every theater, the quiet truth was clear. While generals planned the battles, it was the workers of Richmond and the man who believed in their impossible speed, who had armed them to win. From the sparks of that 4-day miracle, America had built not just ships, but the backbone of victory. By the time the guns of Europe began to fall silent in 1945, Henry Kaiser's revolution in production had already transformed the landscape of war. Across the United States, the effects of his methods could be seen not just in shipyards, but in factories, railways, and airfields. The Liberty ship, once a desperate experiment, and had become the most produced cargo vessel in history. In total, 2,710 Liberty ships were built between 1941 and 1945. More than half of them came from yards that used Kaiser's methods. Each carried food, ammunition, fuel, and vehicles to the far corners of the world, from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of Burma. Many were lost to U-boats, mines, and storms, but for every ship sunk, another 2 or 3 replaced it within weeks. The German Navy could no longer keep up. What began as a logistical nightmare had turned into a production triumph. By late 1944, the Allies controlled the seas, and it was the Liberty ship, slow, boxy, and unremarkable, that made it possible. As one British admiral remarked, the Liberty ship is the ship that won the war. In Richmond alone, more than 747 Liberty ships slid into the Pacific. The yards operated around the clock, even on Christmas Day. The workers, many of them women, minorities, and first-time industrial laborers, had achieved what pre-war experts said was impossible. And when the final ships launched, they did so to the sound of sirens and applause, a ritual that had become almost sacred. Kaiser himself became a national symbol. Newspapers printed his photograph beside Roosevelt and Churchill. Time magazine called him the man who taught America to work faster. Yet behind the public praise lay a quiet truth. Kaiser's genius wasn't in invention, but in orchestration. He didn't design ships, he designed systems. Those systems changed lives. The Kaiser shipyards introduced new standards in industrial welfare. Workers received free medical care through the Kaiser Permanente health plan, originally created to keep them healthy on the job. It was so successful that it continued after the war, evolving into one of the largest healthcare providers in America. The concept of employer-based health coverage, now a fixture of American life, had its roots in Kaiser's wartime experiment. Equally revolutionary was his approach to social inclusion. When the war began, few women or African Americans worked in heavy industry. By 1944, they were essential. Women made up nearly 25% of Kaiser's workforce. Many became supervisors, inspectors, and foremen. Black workers, once confined to menial labor, became welders, machinists, and electricians. Kaiser believed that skill, not background, should define a worker. It was a philosophy decades ahead of its time. The shipyards became microcosms of the America that would follow, chaotic, diverse, industrious, and driven by shared purpose. For many workers, the experience was transformative. After the war, they carried their new skills into peacetime industries, fueling the post-war boom. The Kaiser way spread into housing, automobiles, and construction, shaping the economy of the late 1940s and 1950s. Yet amid all the SUCs, the Liberty ships themselves carried a quieter, more somber legacy. Built fast and cheaply, they were not meant to last. Their thin steel hulls welded under immense pressure, often cracked in cold seas. Some broke apart without warning. Engineers learned hard lessons from these failures, paving the way for stronger designs in the future. Still, most Liberty ships endured. They became the workhorses of the Allied fleet, humble but vital. After the war, hundreds were sold to civilian shipping lines or repurposed for reconstruction. Some carried refugees and displaced families. Others hauled food to famine-stricken Europe under the Marshall Plan. A few remain afloat today, preserved as floating museums, silent tributes to the workers who built them. For Kaiser, the war was only the beginning. He shifted his empire from weapons to welfare, applying wartime efficiency to peace. He built affordable housing, launched the first mass-produced cars in the West Coast market, and invested in aluminum and steel production. But perhaps his greatest creation was not material at all. It was cultural. He had proven that civilian effort could rival military might, that ordinary people, when given purpose, could move mountains, or in this case, build a fleet. His 4-day miracle with the SS Robert E. Peary was more than a stunt. It was the spark that ignited an entire industrial awakening. In later years, historians would debate the true importance of the Liberty ship program. Some argued that even without Kaiser's methods, American industry would have overwhelmed the Axis. Others insisted that his approach shortened the war by months, maybe even a year. But what none disputed was that Kaiser had redefined how nations fight. He had shown that victory was no longer about the courage of soldiers alone. It was about organization, logistics, and the ability to outproduce the enemy. The battlefield had expanded, from trenches and skies to the assembly lines and shipyards of home. As one wartime poster in Richmond declared, and thanks to Kaiser, it wasn't just a slogan, it was reality. But while the world celebrated the triumph of speed, Kaiser himself was already looking ahead, toward a new frontier where the lessons of war could be used to build peace. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the Richmond shipyards fell silent for the first time in years. The clanging of steel, the thunder of cranes, and the hiss of welders faded into memory. Empty slipways stretched toward the bay, and the air that once rang with urgency now carried only the cries of seagulls. The workers who had built the backbone of the Allied fleet began to return home, to cities, farms, and small towns scattered across America. Yet they left behind something far greater than ships. They left behind a legacy of how a free nation could mobilize itself in its hour of need. Henry Kaiser walked through the now quiet yard in late 1945, hands in his coat pockets, hat low against the wind. Around him stews the remains of his empire of speed, warehouses, assembly lines, and cranes that had turned raw metal into salvation. "We proved what people can do," he said softly to a reporter. He wasn't talking about machines. He was talking about people, welders, riveters, foremen, clerks, and cooks, the men and women who had made the impossible normal. The numbers still staggered the imagination. In less than 4 years, the Kaiser shipyards had produced more tonnage than all of America's pre-war shipbuilding combined. Richmond alone had launched 747 Liberty ships and 27 Victory ships. The methods pioneered there spread to shipyards in Portland, Vancouver, and beyond, enabling a national output that dwarfed every other nation's combined efforts. The United States had built a merchant fleet so vast that it could replace every wartime loss twice over. But the real triumph lay not in the ships themselves. It lay in the human transformation that powered them. Kaiser's workforce, drawn from every walk of life, had discovered an identity larger than any single background. Black and white, male and female, skilled and unskilled, all had labored side by side under the same floodlights, driven by a shared belief that their work mattered. For many, it was their first taste of equality, and they would not forget it. Women, especially, emerged changed. The Kaiser welders, who had once been homemakers, teachers, or waitresses, returned to civilian life with new confidence and new expectations. They had handled torches, operated cranes, supervised teams. They had earned good wages and respect. Many refused to go back to the old norms. In a quiet but profound way, the Liberty shipyards helped launch another revolution, the post-war movement for women's equality in the workplace. African-American workers experienced similar change. Though discrimination persisted, the Kaiser yards were among the first large-scale employers to promote black workers into skilled positions. The company's anti-discrimination stance, rare for its time, inspired later civil rights efforts in industry. "We were building ships," one worker later recalled, "but we were also building something bigger, a future that looked more like everyone." The social structures Kaiser had built to support his workforce didn't vanish with the war either. His shipyard health program evolved into Kaiser Permanente, offering comprehensive medical coverage to thousands of former workers and their families. It became the foundation of modern American healthcare, a system born not from politics, but from necessity on the industrial front lines. And Kaiser himself? He refused to retire. When most war contractors closed their doors, he opened new ones. He launched Kaiser Aluminum, Kaiser Steel, and Kaiser Motors, aiming to bring wartime efficiency to peacetime prosperity. He dreamed of building affordable homes, cars, and even entire communities using the same prefabrication principles that had built Liberty ships. To him, peace was simply another challenge, aimed to engineer. He built entire towns near his factories, complete with schools, hospitals, and parks. He sponsored housing projects for returning veterans and funded medical research. He saw no reason why the spirit that built ships couldn't build better lives. If we can build a ship in 4 days, he said, why not a house in 1? The Liberty shipyards themselves were dismantled over time. By 1950, most of the structures at Richmond were gone. But one shipyard crane still stands today, preserved as a monument. Beneath it, a plaque bears the names of the men and women who built ships faster than the world thought possible. A handful of Liberty ships also survive. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien, built in Maine, and the SS John W. Brown from Baltimore are fully restored and operational. The O'Brien even sailed to Normandy in 1994 for the 50th anniversary of D-Day, a living reminder of the fleet that fed and armed the free world. Standing on her deck, one can still hear the faint echo of Kaiser's miracle, the rhythm of rivets, the hum of welders, the heartbeat of a nation at work. Historians would later call the Liberty ship the ship that won the war, but that title misses something deeper. It wasn't just the ship, it was the system and the spirit behind it. Kaiser's method redefined warfare by turning it into a question of organization and belief. The shipyards proved that courage didn't only live in foxholes, it lived in factories. In Germany, Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, later admitted that he envied the American model of production. We could never match their pace, he said. They built like a storm. That storm had started with one man's idea, that nothing was truly impossible if broken into smaller, solvable parts. When Kaiser died in 1967, his obituary in the New York Times called him the man who built ships faster than anyone in history. But for those who had known him, that description felt too small. He had built more than ships. He had built confidence in human potential. He had shown that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary results when given trust, purpose, and leadership. And so, in the quiet aftermath of war, as the last Liberty ships carried their final cargoes across calm seas, they carried more than supplies. They carried a message forged in steel and sweat, that even in the darkest times, human ingenuity can light the way forward. That message, born in the sparks of Richmond, would endure far beyond the war, shaping how nations work, build, and believe to this very day. In the grand history of World War II, names like Eisenhower, Churchill, and Patton dominate the headlines. Yet behind every victory they commanded stood a different kind of general, a man without medals or uniforms, whose battlefield was measured not in miles, but in man-hours. Henry Kaiser never led troops, but he led a nation's will to build. The story of the Liberty ships is, at its core, the story of human potential unchained. What began as a desperate race against time became proof that courage and creativity could exist far from the front lines. In a world gripped by fear, Kaiser's shipyards became beacons of hope. Tiny places where belief in the impossible was not just encouraged, but expected. Each Liberty ship that rolled off the slipways carried more than steel and cargo. It carried the collective effort of millions. Welders who worked through the night, mothers who left home to learn new trades, engineers who reimagined industry itself. Their fingerprints are still there, hidden beneath the paint and rivets, silent witnesses to the moment when production itself became an act of defiance. When historians call World War II the arsenal of democracy, they are describing what Kaiser embodied. He didn't invent patriotism, he industrialized it. By transforming chaos into coordination, he showed that the true strength of a nation lies not in its machines, but in the hands that build them. And so, decades later, as the remaining Liberty ships rest quietly in harbors, they remind us that victory was not only fought with guns and strategy, it was welded together piece by people who refused to believe in limits. From a single 4-day miracle on the foggy shores of Richmond came a lesson that still endures. Progress is not born from perfection, but from purpose. Henry Kaiser once said, "Problems are only opportunities in work clothes." In 4 days and 15 hours, he proved it. And in doing so, he taught the world that even in war, creation, not destruction, is the greatest act of strength.